Hello everyone, welcome to WION World is One. This is WION Rewind 2023.
A year of trials and tribulations, a year of turmoil.
I am Shivan Channa.
And I'm Hemkaur Soroya. On the show, we delve into the events and developments that shaped the world in the past year.
Our journey begins with the seismic shifts in global politics, focusing on the enigmatic rise of Xi Jinping as China grapples with deepening domestic crisis.
This was also the year we witnessed Vladimir Putin's authority facing unprecedented challenges on home turf.
And while the Russia-Ukraine war entered its second year, the world witnessed the bloodiest war in West Asia between Israel and Hamas. While the war still rages on, the region has witnessed major realignments and upheavals this year.
And speaking of upheavals, Africa witnessed a tense season of coups.
We will also analyze the slump of the Conservatives in the UK. This despite the rise of the right wing in Europe.
As we cross the Atlantic, we revisit the dramatic return of Trump, complete with arraignments, legal cases, and a surprising rise in poll numbers.
Meanwhile, President Joe Biden grappled with his worst year in politics, setting the stage for a riveting political landscape.
The ever-evolving US-China relations take center stage yet again with the balloon crisis and crucial meetings between Xi and Biden.
In the East, North Korea found allies in Moscow and Beijing, while South Korea and Japan set aside traditional differences to align with the United States. The year also saw countries reeling under high debt burden as global debt reached the $300 trillion mark.
Join us on this riveting journey through the events that define the year 2023 as we navigate the complex web of global affairs. For China, 2023 has been a year of tectonic shifts. From Balloon Gate to Xi's consolidation of power, China's 2023 journey is marked by significant political, economic and diplomatic developments.
Xi Jinping's third term symbolizes a critical shift in Chinese political norms, reinforcing his centralized leadership style. Beyond its borders too, China's territorial ambitions continued in its signature aggressive manner.
And of course, we also saw its increasing involvement in West Asia. Here's a look at China's 2023 journey marked by diplomatic overtures, rifts and a hot air balloon that dominated headlines for weeks.
On the 10th of March, to no one's surprise, Xi Jinping was awarded an unprecedented third term as China's president, solidifying his position as the most powerful leader in modern Chinese history. This move marked a significant departure from the precedent of leadership transition established in the post-Mao era. Reflecting Xi's consolidated control over the Chinese political landscape. And, as has been the case in China for quite a while now, control over private lives and thought grew stronger. Something that will see a steady increase through the course of the year. Xi Jinping's ideological influence expanded significantly, with Xi Jinping thought being increasingly integrated into various aspects of Chinese society, including education, government, and the military. As China's diplomatic overtures continued in the international realm, it also reaffirmed ties with old friends. A grand welcome for Xi Jinping in Russia was a sign of the close ties between the two powers that have been increasingly isolated on the global stage. Xi Jinping's rise in the domestic and international sphere was accompanied by a strange phenomenon. And that is the strange and mysterious disappearance of Chinese ministers. Qin Gang was last seen in public on the 25th of June. No reason, no explanation, and just like that, Qin Gang was removed from his position as former minister, and Wang Yi took his place. The case was not very different for Li Shangfu, China's defense minister. last seen in public in August. Li Shangfu met a similar fate. What do we make of this purge? Your guess is as good as ours. Cracks had started to emerge in Xi Jinping's rule. The domestic crisis had begun to catch up after finally emerging out of the zero-COVID rule. There were other challenges awaiting Xi's rule. The year of the rabbit, meant to be the year of prosperity, was anything but. Joblessness rose to record highs, and the woes of the real estate sector were far too severe to ignore. Just as the world was starting to live a life out of the clutches of the COVID-19 pandemic, a new outbreak, quite similar to the one reported in 2019, sent the world in a frenzy. And China's usual secrecy and opacity with regards to the origins and data of this pneumonia outbreak did not help ease tensions at all. Once again, the world was worried if China was choosing to look the other way in the face of another health crisis. Internationally, Xi Jinping escalated tensions by asserting claims in the South China Sea, deploying troops along the Indian border, expressing intentions to annex Taiwan, and increasing friction with Japan, a US ally. This aggressive stance was met with significant resistance from the West. The West has implemented restrictions on exporting semiconductor technology and limited investments in China's advanced technology sectors. China was forced to take a step back and rethink its aggressive strategy. This brings us to the highly anticipated and watched meet of the year, the Biden-Xi summit. This meeting marked a pivotal moment in Sino-US relations. But China doesn't stray too far away from its own script. No matter what, its aggressive strategies have been a recurring theme. The latest clashes with the Philippines in disputed waters, juxtaposed with its diplomatic outreach in Vietnam, are a testament to how China operates. One hand throws a punch while the other extends an olive branch. China's expansionist policies remain intact. And despite diplomatic overtures and a thaw in US-China relations in the international sphere, all is not well.
We now shift focus to Xi Jinping's no-limits partner, Vladimir Putin. But how often have we seen his authority challenged?
From an international call for Putin's arrest in 123 countries to an attempted armed mutiny against Moscow by one of Putin's most trusted men to finally a grand hero's welcome in the Gulf. It all happened in 2023.
Here's a timeline which at least Vladimir Putin will never forget. Take a look.
Seeing Joe Biden standing on Ukrainian soil on the first anniversary of the Russia-Ukraine war in February, there was no doubt that it was a clear message to Vladimir Putin of what he's up against. Soon began a series of events this year which had the potential to shake Russia to its core.
As a court of law, the judges issued arrest
On March
warrants.
17th, an arrest warrant was issued against Putin by the International Criminal Court. Putin's arrest was mandated for committing war crimes in Ukraine. He was held responsible for unlawfully deporting and transferring children from Ukraine into Russia. The warrant implies that Putin will be arrested if he steps foot in any of the 123 member nations of the ICC, which includes South Africa, forcing Putin to give the BRICS summit a miss this year. It marks the first time that the ICC issued an arrest warrant against one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. On May 20th, the Wagner mercenary group that fought for Putin in Ukraine announced the capture of the embattled Ukrainian city of Bakhmut. This was a big gain for Putin as it came after months of intense fighting and gave Russia direct access of two more cities of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. But Bakhmut came at a cost, as the Wagner mercenaries soon turned hostile against Moscow. On June 23rd, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the former head of the Wagner mercenary group and one of Putin's most trusted men, released a video stepping up his feud with Russia's military top brass. He called out the leaders for not providing Wagner fighters with the necessary aid they needed to fight in Ukraine, and also rejected Putin's justification of invading Ukraine. Soon after this video and the following day, on June 24th, Russia was nearly shaken to its core. Prigozhin released visuals of his men crossing the border from Ukraine into Russia, mentioning how they were ready to go all the way against the Russian military. Wagner fighters entered the southern Russian city of Rostov-on-Don, taking control of the city and key military installations, including a crucial aerodrome used by Russian forces to mount attacks on Ukraine. Matters soon simmered as Russia dodged a massive civil war. A truce was brokered on the very same day, and soon the Wagner mercenary chief Yevgeny Prigozhin was directed to Belarus under a deal brokered by Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko to end the armed mutiny which aimed at taking over Moscow. While it seemed that the Wagner and Prigozhin conundrum had been settled once and for all, there was more. On August 23rd, a private jet carrying Yevgeny Prigozhin and 9 senior Wagner commanders crashed north of Moscow with no survivors. Both Moscow and Washington suggested foul play, while the Kremlin considered the possibility of an assassination event. While a US intelligence assessment concluded that an intentional explosion caused the plane crash, Moscow rubbished all claims denying any involvement in the crash. Post-August 2023 got better for Vladimir Putin. While the much-anticipated Ukrainian counteroffensive was deemed a failure, reports also emerged of an accelerated Russian industrial production index by 2%, with Russia pledging a boost to its defense budget by 70%. In October, Putin was ceremoniously welcomed by China to attend the third Belt and Road Forum. The visit underscored Russia and China's no-limits partnership. The Russian President Vladimir Putin received a hero's welcome as he visited West Asia. It was a one-day lightning tour to the UAE and Saudi Arabia. While Putin's bonhomie with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was evident from their body language, in UAE, Putin was welcomed with a 21-gun salute and a flyby of UAE fighter jets trailing smoke in the colors of the Russian national flag. Putin's ceremonious welcomes in West Asia were not missed on the West, setting the stage for 2024 as Russia stands firm in the ongoing Ukraine war, while Joe Biden struggles to provide further funds for Ukraine's war effort.
We now turn our attention to West Asia. For over a decade, the West Asian region had witnessed violence, bloodshed and strife. From a civil war in Syria, to terrorism in Iraq, to bombings in Yemen, the region remained a hotbed of conflicts, causing close to 1 million casualties and creating global refugee crisis. While each of these conflicts had a unique context, the common theme between all of them was the regional rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Divided on sectarian lines, the power struggle between Sunni Saudi Arabia and Shia Iran led to the creation of proxies across the West Asian region, with Iran backing the Houthi rebels in Yemen, Hezbollah fighters in Lebanon, and even Sunni Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Of course, the region is rich in natural resources like oil. The region also had military bases of superpowers like the US and Russia, among others. But something was cooking behind the scenes.
The pictures that shocked the world. Top officials from Iran and Saudi Arabia met in Beijing. And after 4 days of hectic negotiations mediated by China, the announcement was made. Iran and Saudi Arabia had decided to resume ties. Ties that could help restore stability in the region. With Iran offering a cushion from any attempts to sabotage the talks, both the countries decided to restart embassies that had been shut down in 2016. The Saudi foreign minister visited Tehran shortly after the truce was announced. Within weeks of the thaw between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the process of inclusion began for Iran's proxies. A peace process was launched for the Houthis in Yemen. The rebel leaders that had overthrown the Saudi-backed leadership during the so-called Arab Spring had been at war with Saudi Arabia. Now their leaders were flown to Riyadh for peace talks. Iran-backed Syrian President Bashar al-Assad got an invitation for the Arab League meetings for the first time since 2011. Syria was expelled from the grouping in 2011 after the outbreak of the civil war. The undisclosed talks in Beijing, followed by all these developments, caught the West by surprise. The US hegemony in the region was being challenged, and Washington was in no mood to loosen its grip on the region. Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, confirmed to the world that Saudi Arabia was in talks with Israel and that a US-mediated pact was in the works. The normalization of relations with Israel meant the issue of Palestinian statehood would get swept under the carpet. The precedent was already there. In 2020, Arab nations like United Arab Emirates and Bahrain had signed normalization deals with Israel. And now Saudi Arabia too was looking to close a defense deal with the US as part of this normalization pact with Israel. It was early morning when air raid sirens rang in Jerusalem. Hundreds of rockets were fired into south and central Israel, and they all came from Gaza. This was followed by Hamas gunmen barging into Israel, opening indiscriminate fire and fleeing back to Gaza with almost 250 hostages. Days later, Israel counted at least 1,200 casualties in the deadly terror attack that caught the world by surprise. Shocked by the audacity of the attack, Israel declared war on Hamas. What followed in Gaza was mayhem. Rockets, missiles, air raids, tanks. The Israeli Defense Forces flattened the Gaza Strip, bringing down buildings, many of them with residents still inside. The death toll in Gaza began spiraling. Each day, hundreds of dead bodies arrived at hospitals in north and central Gaza, where thousands of people with bombing-related injuries were being treated. Hospitals, schools, relief camps. Israel's bombing was relentless. With social media flooded with images of dead bodies, including that of Palestinian women and children, wide-scale protests were triggered across the streets of West Asia. From Iran to Iraq and from Jordan to Lebanon, the Arab and Islamic world were up in arms. At the beginning of the year, not many analysts would have predicted this. Iran's President Ibrahim Raisi's arrival in Riyadh was one of the most significant developments in the region's recent history. Leaders of the Arab League as well as those from Islamic countries buried their differences to attend the extraordinary summit for Gaza. At the end of the summit, the grouping sent out a desperate call for a ceasefire. The outrage in the Arab world also meant Mohammed bin Salman would now find it difficult to still pursue the Israel normalization deal. The year that started with hope for peace in the region was once again caught in the cycle of violence, with geopolitics once again throwing the region into turmoil.
Artificial borders, weak state institutions, corrupt statesmen, fragile ethnic accords, and an ever-deepening inequality.
What does all of it lead to? A coup d'etat. Derived from French, it literally means a stroke of state. More generally, a coup is an illegal and overt attempt by the military or civilian elite to unseat an incumbent leadership.
And the African continent has seen not one, not two, but several such attempts within this year.
Reports of gunfire in the capital, followed by a television announcement that the president has been deposed by mutinous soldiers. The increasingly familiar storyline unfolded again this year in Africa. First in Niger, then in Gabon. The resurgence of military coups renewed concerns about democracy backsliding on the continent. It also underscored shifting regional alliances at a time when international peacekeeping efforts waned. The year started with infighting breaking out in Sudan. The rival factions of the military rulers of the country began fighting for power in April this year, following disagreement over an internationally backed political transition plan. At least 250,000 people have fled the fighting. The conflict has displaced more than 7 million people, left Khartoum in ruins, caused a humanitarian crisis, and triggered ethnically driven killings in Darfur. Moving from Sudan in the Sahel region, we get to Niger. On July 26th this year, Niger's government was overthrown and President Mohamed Bazoum was taken hostage. The Economic Community of West African States issued an ultimatum to the coup leaders.
Release President Mohamed Bazoum, his family and associates immediately and without condition.
Threatening military intervention if deposed Bazoum was not returned to power. ECOWAS member states suspended relations with Niger and closed their land and air borders with the country. On August 20th, the main coup leader and self-proclaimed head of state, General Abdurrahman Tiani, presented his roadmap in a televised address. The plan enunciates a transition period of no more than 3 years and an inclusive national dialogue. He also reiterated that his country would defend itself in the event of a military intervention. Moving south, from Niger, we get to Gabon. On August 30th, Gabon's Election Commission announced that President Ali Bongo Ondimba had been elected to a third term. Just hours later, a group of Gabonese military officers from the elite Presidential Guard unit seized power and placed the president under arrest at his palace. Later that day, the officers declared General Brice Oligui Nguema as chairman of the transition. While the election itself had been marred by reports of irregularities, the officers' coup roped in Gabon to the string of African states that saw military rulers taking over this year. Finally, we get to Sierra Leone. On November 26th, unidentified gunmen targeted the Wilberforce military barracks and several police stations and correctional centers in Freetown, Sierra Leone. The Minister of Information and Civic Education declared the attacks in the capital as an unsuccessful coup attempt to overthrow the government. Although unsuccessful, the number of coups and coup attempts this year in Africa has sent the message. Democracy is facing a steep challenge in the continent, and a Western-style form of government may not be tenable in many African states.
The year 2023 saw a tremendous rise of the right wing across the globe, be it France, Germany, Finland, the Netherlands, in Europe, to the United States and Argentina across the Atlantic.
Well, the rise of the right, especially the far right, was evident in all these regions. Stricter immigration laws, Islamophobic attitude, hesitation for LGBTQ rights, and climate change denial. These are some of the distinctive features of the far right narrative.
Now, the rise of the far right meant the consolidation of some or all of these narratives. France was on the boil in June this year. A teenage boy of Algerian and Moroccan descent was killed by the police. The violence that ensued after the killing was primarily attributed to young individuals, including minors and migrants from Black and Arab communities.
Over a span of 5 consecutive nights, France witnessed widespread riots, resulting in over 3,000 arrests nationwide. This incident has brought to the fore the extent of racial polarization in France.
Enter the far right. Le Pen's party, the National Rally, did really well in last year's French presidential election. The party is set to gain seats in the European Parliament elections next June as well. Mainstream politicians worry the far right is already poised to strike in France as well.
Now, the rise in anti-Semitic incidents linked to the Israel-Hamas war, as well as recent terror attacks and other incidents of violence, have once again sparked debate about French identity, immigration, and extremist violence. The RNs has now risen from a fringe movement known as racist and xenophobic to a firmly entrenched player in mainstream French politics.
And talking about right-wing entrenching itself in mainstream politics, let's also shift our focus to the Netherlands now. The victory of Geert Wilders, a far-right anti-Islam populist, in the parliamentary election has put the Netherlands at a crossroads. The nation was long seen as one of the most socially liberal countries in Europe. Wilders' Party for Freedom emerged as the single largest party with 37 seats in the 150-member lower house.
Wilders is now on a potential path towards becoming the country's first far-right prime minister. Over the years, Wilders has built an image of himself as one of the most radical far-right populists in Europe. He has called for de-Islamizing the Netherlands, shutting down mosques, banning the Quran, and closing the borders to migrants from Muslim-majority countries.
He made the influx of migrants a political issue during the campaign, which appears to have helped him deal the greatest blow to the political establishment. Across the Atlantic, another populist far-right candidate rose to power in Argentina.
In just 3 years, Javier Milei, an eccentric libertarian economist, managed to create a political party and become president of Argentina. Milei's campaign was based on radical political and economic ideas. Politically, he proposed the deregulation of gun possession, the creation of a marketplace for human organs, and minimized the human rights violations of the military government in the 1970s.
Throughout his campaign, he also engaged in many extraordinary, high-impact stunts, throwing creative insults at his opponents, calling the Pope the representative of evil on earth, and waving a chainsaw in public rallies are just some of them.
Now, since coming to power last month, the Milei administration already announced severe public spending cuts and a decision to weaken the value of the Argentinian peso by more than 50% against the US dollar. More of such actions are expected in the coming months as well.
Now, enough on the rise of the right. We now come to a nation where the Conservatives are in a fix. The United Kingdom. The Conservative Party is again in a state of self-inflicted crisis in the UK. Just this month, the Immigration Minister resigned from the government of Rishi Sunak.
The Sunak government has brought another version of the Rwanda asylum plan. The earlier plan was struck down by the Supreme Court this year, although there is no guarantee that the reworked flagship legislation will pass. What was once a policy whim is now seen as a life or death matter for Tory lawmakers.
The Labour is gaining ground as the Conservative crisis deepens. The Labour Party now has a 20-point lead over the Tories. For the United States, 2023 was a roller coaster ride, and the man in the driver's seat was Donald Trump.
The year saw the former president of the US rising from the ashes. Back-to-back legal troubles, indictments and arraignments once seemed more than enough to weigh Trump down. They could have been his downfall, but he turned them into opportunities.
Trump not only remained the most popular man in the grand old party, but come the colder months, he also established himself as the favorite face in the 2024 race. The break his rivals have long sought still seems as distant as ever.
91 criminal charges across 4 indictments. The numbers that sum up the year that Donald Trump has seen. But the only numbers that seem to matter for the former president are his soaring poll numbers. March 2023, Donald Trump opened up a new chapter in American history. This was the first time that a current or former president was criminally charged. An event that was matched 3 other times in the summer that followed, all courtesy to the same man. The domino effect was triggered by Trump's indictment by a Manhattan grand jury. The charges were related to a 2016 episode. A hush money payment to an adult movie star, Stormy Daniels. Prosecutors allege that Trump was a part of a plan to suppress negative information. An illegal conspiracy to undermine the integrity of the 2016 election. Adding another thread to the string of cases came in the Mar-a-Lago documents, bringing along the question of whether Trump mishandled classified material. Trump faces charges of taking classified national defense documents from the White House after he left the office and resisting the government's attempts to retrieve the materials. Both Trump and his aide have pleaded not guilty. US President Joe Biden's victory in the 2020 election was soon followed by an attack on the Capitol by Trump supporters on January 6th. Trump's third indictment that came into the picture in August this year. It alleges that the Capitol attack was an effort by the former president and his allies to overturn the results of the election. It also alleges that another co-conspirator pushed then Vice President Mike Pence to violate the law to delay Biden's victory. And again, Trump has pleaded not guilty to all counts. Just a couple of weeks later, the Republican leader was indicted yet again, this time in Fulton County along with 18 office associates. All of them face conspiracy charges related to attempts to overturn Trump's 2020 election loss in Georgia. 3 of the associates have already pleaded guilty, but of course, not Trump. Through the arraignments, Trump's campaign has not just continued unabated, it has thrived. His poll ratings have only risen since the first indictment. Most Republican voters see the charges as politically motivated. They believe that the man has been wronged. If something remained constant through the year, it appears it was the bond between Trump and his supporters. Further, the dissatisfaction surrounding President Biden's handling of the US economy. That has only backed Trump's narrative to make America great again. And now, opinion polls reflect Trump's hold clearer than ever, as he enters into 2024 with his largest lead over President Biden.
2023 showed the world that as much as the multipolar narrative is gaining traction, superpower politics still dominates geopolitics. Rest of the world closely follows how the great powers engage among themselves. The United States and China are the undisputed great powers at the moment, and their rivalry dominated headlines almost all of this year. Starting with February, US-China ties were upended by what Washington claims were Chinese surveillance balloons flying over the United States. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken called off a planned trip to China, in fact, thereafter due to the alleged surveillance balloon, and tensions were high. The coming months saw tensions rising further. China's Defense Minister Li Shangfu turned down a meeting with US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin during the Shangri-La Defense Dialogue in Singapore. The very next day, a Chinese Navy ship cut across the path of an American destroyer in the Taiwan Strait, and the entire world took notice. 2 months later, we saw some engagements finally taking place. On September 9th, US President Joe Biden had a brief exchange with Chinese Premier Li Qiang, while both were at the Group of 20 summit in New Delhi. A week later, US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan held a 12-hour-long talk with Chinese top diplomat Wang Yi in Malta. 20 days later, on the 9th of October then, Chinese President met US Senate delegation led by Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. This was the first congressional delegation to visit China in 4 years. Now, just when we thought the two superpowers were working towards rapprochement, the United States broadened its export controls to stop China from acquiring advanced computer chips and the equipment to manufacture them. Finally, days before the big meet between Biden and Xi, top Chinese diplomat Wang Yi met US counterpart Antony Blinken in Washington, as the two sides laid the groundwork to hammer out the details for a Biden-Xi summit. And that brings us to the big day. After a year of strained ties, US President Joe Biden finally met visiting Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in San Francisco. This closely watched meeting came almost 1 year after the leaders last met. Despite not achieving a joint statement or formal cooperation declaration, the summit ended on a positive note. The two countries also agreed to resume military-to-military communication, which was a huge development as military links were cut by China last year after then US House of Representatives Speaker Nancy Pelosi made a visit to Taiwan. In San Francisco, President Xi Jinping said after the meeting that the door to talks between the two great powers cannot be closed again.
Let's now take a look at the Far East, where tensions ran high this year. North Korea's relentless missile tests continued as South Korea and Japan got closer.
The United States, meanwhile, increased its presence in the region with more drills and military posturing in the Korean waters. Let's take a look at all that has happened in the Far East theatre this year.
Pyongyang started 2023 with a bang. In the early morning of New Year's Day, it fired one short-range ballistic missile into the East Sea. Neighboring Japan and South Korea got the message. The year was going to be tough in the Far East. And nowhere were the tensions higher than in the Korean peninsula. North Korean belligerence continued all through the year. With scores of missile tests evenly distributed through the year, the US was not going to tolerate its allies being bullied in the Far East. US President Joe Biden hosted South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida at Camp David. This is the first ever standalone summit between the US, Japan, and South Korea. The summit marked a new era in trilateral relations, underscoring tectonic shifts in the regional security dynamics in the Far East. US convinced South Korea and Japan to drop historical hesitations by standing together against a common enemy. Days later, the countries staged joint naval missile drills off the Korean peninsula, infuriating North Korea. The drills came in the backdrop of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un calling for radically modernizing the weapons and equipment of its naval forces. North Korea responded by more missile tests and nuclear threats, and by finding an ally in the region for itself. Kim Jong-un undertook a days-long journey by train to reach a spaceport in Russia's Far East. He met Russian President Vladimir Putin and assured him of his full backing in Russia's sacred fight with the West. After the hours-long talks, Putin said Russia would help North Korea launch satellites. As the leaders said after the meet, the summit was a clear manifestation of North Korea, prioritizing the strategic importance of its relations with Russia. Just 1 month later, the South Korean, the United States, and Japanese militaries upped the ante. The Allies conducted their first ever trilateral aerial exercise. The Camp David agreements were taking shape. Fighter jets from Japan and South Korea roared in the skies, as America's nuclear-capable B-52 bomber stole the show. Not that South Korea and Japan are not putting individual efforts. This year, the neighbors agreed to share real-time information on North Korean missile tests. And Tokyo committed to a dramatic twofold rise in its defense budget. The tensions are high and a rapprochement is far from sight. The countries of the Far East know it. The great powers know it. And all of them are preparing for the worst. Sirens blared in Japan's Okinawa once again. But this was not a missile test by North Korea. This time, Pyongyang launched a satellite into space. And this was not an ordinary satellite. Instead, it was North Korea's first military reconnaissance spy satellite. North Korea achieved the feat in its third attempt, having failed twice earlier this year. For North Korea, this was a much-desired success, and a helping hand from Moscow behind the success cannot be ruled out. This triggered a fresh wave of tensions across the Korean peninsula. South Korea responded by suspending parts of the 2018 Comprehensive Military Agreement. Seoul also restored aerial surveillance and reconnaissance activities for signs of North Korean provocations along the border. It has vowed further actions depended on Pyongyang's next move. The Far East is clearly among the most volatile regions on the planet. And presence of the nuclear capabilities with North Korea is only making matters worse. At times like these, just one miscalculation would render unimaginable consequences for the entire world.
We now come to India's western neighbour. The year 2023 has been one of the most tumultuous for the country in decades. a massive surge in terror attacks, an unprecedented economic crisis, an equally unprecedented challenge to the military.
And finally, a devastating crackdown on the main opposition party. In our next section on the WION Rewind 2023 Year of Turmoil, we take you to Pakistan.
In Pakistan, the year started with back-to-back terror attacks. On an average, the nation witnessed over 7 terror attacks per month. Reports say over 1,400 people lost their lives in these attacks, including an overwhelming majority of security personnel. Pakistan's security forces were the main target in most of these attacks. The Taliban takeover of Kabul emboldened its Pakistani offshoot. The Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, or the TTP, carried out an alarming number of terror attacks in the country. Why this year in particular? Because Islamabad was going through one of its worst phases in decades. Inflation was rampant. Foreign reserves were running dangerously low. A default was looming. And IMF was not ready to help unconditionally. A bailout would come later at its own cost. Something as big as an economic fallout was brewing in the political circles. Former Prime Minister Imran Khan was relentlessly attacking the Shehbaz Sharif-led government, which was in power earlier this year. Shehbaz Sharif-led coalition took over in April last year after ousting Imran Khan-led Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf government. Alleging foreign conspiracy behind his ouster, Imran Khan had been calling for snap elections. The call grew louder this year after Election Commission delayed the polls. Early this year, Imran Khan went ballistic on the government, and the government retaliated with corruption charges and arrest warrants against Khan. The very first attempt to arrest the former Prime Minister was made in March this year. PTI workers gathered around Imran Khan's Lahore residence, fighting off security forces. The clashes turned violent. Hours later, the police backed down and an arrest was averted. But defiant Khan kept up the attacks on government. Days later, Imran Khan publicly accused a senior intelligence officer of orchestrating plans to assassinate him. Pakistan's all-powerful army took a serious note of the accusation. On May 9th, 2023, Imran Khan repeated his accusations against a senior intelligence officer. This was right before departing for Islamabad to attend the hearing of his bail application at the Islamabad High Court. And this is where the trajectory of Pakistani politics changed. Just as Imran Khan was in the process of submitting his biometric data, paramilitary forces of Pakistan Rangers forcibly entered the premises. They broke a window to enter a room where Imran Khan was present. Several personnel of the Pakistan Rangers grabbed Khan out of the courtroom. Forcible detention, which was caught live on cameras, sparked nationwide outrage. Public transport, public offices, buildings, none of them were spared. And in a fuss, people began attacking army establishments. After more than 24 hours of incessant protests and arson, the Supreme Court of Pakistan granted bail to Imran Khan and termed his arrest illegal. But the damage was done. The authority of Pakistan's most powerful institution was challenged, and the army was not going to let this go no matter what. Thus began the massive crackdown on Imran Khan's PTI party. Leaders, party workers, and Imran Khan himself were booked under military law. PTI leaders were arrested, released, and then arrested again. The pressure on the top leadership was so immense that many gave in. Some left Imran Khan's party, others left politics altogether. The fate of Imran Khan was also locked. The Pakistani establishment made it a point that Imran Khan cannot return to Pakistani politics ever again. Khan was ultimately arrested in a grafts case and is still locked up in jail. He is still disqualified from holding public office. His party is still active in mainstream politics with whosoever is left. But no one can say for how long. The country will be holding elections next year. A long-banished Nawaz Sharif has been brought back. The way for Sharif's return to prime ministership has been cleared. It would be no surprise if he wins a 5th term in party politics. But the politics of Pakistan has changed, and Imran Khan has been the harbinger of this change.
"2023 will be a year to forget for countries reeling under high debt burden. Global debt has breached the $300 trillion mark.
Now that woke the world up to the horrors of the debt time bomb. But will 2024 provide any respite? Let's find out in our final segment on the show.
$307 trillion and counting. That's the total debt burden on countries in 2023. Let the numbers sink in. This burden is shared by households, the private sector, and the governments. Debt, in this context, is the money borrowed through bonds issued or loans raised. But what is more worrying is the rise in public debt, also known as the borrowings made by the governments. That has risen by 40% since the COVID-19 pandemic. Public debt is set to reach $97 trillion this year. While the public debt is just about 28% of the total global debt, they have a domino effect on various sectors of the economy. Global debt has been on the upswing since the start of the century. It has risen fourfold since 2000, outpacing the GDP growth in the same period. But the COVID-19 turned out to be the tipping point for global debt. That's because countries began borrowing to keep their economies running. This has led to increasing fiscal deficits and greater debt burden. The Ukraine war and the subsequent economic slowdown has only made matters worse. Developing countries are now facing the heat from rising debt. Developing countries owe almost 30% of the global debt. And China, India, and Brazil constitute 70% of that total. A decade back, only 22 countries had high debt levels. After the pandemic, 59 countries figure in the list. Emerging market economies have higher borrowing costs than the developed world. This adds another dimension to the crisis that could bankrupt poor countries. The worst hit is Africa, which has to pay an 11% average in interest on loans. The impoverished continent sits on a whopping $2 trillion debt bomb. The debt trap is real for the region. Is there a light at the end of the tunnel for debt-ridden countries? There is no definite answer. The recent G20 summit in New Delhi addressed the issue at length. The World Bank and the IMF seek a global framework for debt relief. But a lot would depend on China, a major creditor in Africa. Zambia and Ghana have provided glimpses of China's role in debt restructuring. Will that lead to a global framework? Only time will tell. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
Yes, all of that happened just this year. And with that, it's a wrap on WION Rewind 2023, Year of Turmoil.
We hope that the year 2024 would not be as tumultuous as this one, to say the least. With that, we wish you a very happy new year.
Keep watching WION.